pelvic floor is a huge part of the orgasm. I think that it's a lot more complex than what maybe many people realize. And this is where I want to hopefully change your perspective a little bit, but also give you an idea of what's really happening inside.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. I read online recently that although about 30% of women experience orgasms from penetration, that number could be higher if women had stronger vagina muscles. I get questions often from couples that want to experience more pleasure in sex from intercourse alone, so I'm not alone in thinking that, this could be an important discovery for many people. But I'm a skeptic by nature, so I thought I'd do more research to see if this claim was valid. This search led me to my friend Pauli, a pelvic floor physical therapist. It's a special field of medicine that deals with the muscles around the vagina in your pelvic floor. I thought if anyone could answer the question of if stronger vaginal muscles mean better sex, she would know the answer. And I've learned that there's much, much more to this question that's below the surface. For example, no one likes pain, especially pain during sex. And unfortunately, painful intercourse affects far too many women, making sex a stressful aspect of their relationship. Also, after giving birth, it's common for women to need to cross their legs when they sneeze or cough, or not being able to jump on the trampoline like they used to without worrying if they're going to wet themselves. I invited Pauli, the physical therapist, to join me in a workshop earlier this month that some of you attended. For 90 minutes, she taught a 4-step method to strengthening your vaginal muscles and eliminating pain from intercourse and how to stop leaking when you sneeze. This was a really in-depth workshop, and she also answered many questions. Today, I want to give you a condensed 30-minute version of that workshop. And if you're interested in catching the full presentation, you can find it for free on my website at getyourmarriageon.com and click on blog. Our romantic couples retreat is coming right up. As of this recording, we only have room for 2 more couples. This retreat is not about sitting in a stuffy hotel conference room for hours watching boring slide presentations. This is a true getaway in the sense that you get a vacation with your spouse, have fun, all the while working on intimacy in your marriage. You can find all the exciting details at getyourmarriageon.com and click on Couples Retreat. Yesterday was the kickoff for our 2024 Sextimacy Challenge. Woohoo! Between now and Valentine's Day, you and your spouse can complete simple challenges every day from within the Intimately Us app, accumulate points, and then enter to win prizes. We have over 20 amazing prizes this year. It just gets better and better every year, including sex toys, furniture, lingerie, date night kits, courses, bedroom games, and much, much more. The grand prize this year is airfare for 2 to anywhere in the country, so you don't want to miss out. So download the Intimately Us app today. I sincerely appreciate your podcast reviews. Last week's podcast, if you remember, was about embracing your eroticism, and I included some fun would you rather questions. So I was happy and delighted to see this review this week. This person said, in light of episode 171, would you rather listen to a sports podcast or listen to Get Your Marriage On? Grow old and sexless or keep falling in love with more sex? Try the same old positions or Dan's black belt tips? Frown and complain or smile? Stare at your phones over dinner or talk, share, dream, and laugh? Well, if you're like me, the latter seems all the better. So I guess I'll have to recommend you listen to Dan's podcast with a lot of fire flame emojis. Now, if you'll take a moment to pause this podcast and write a review on Apple Podcasts, and if you hear me read your review on this podcast, send an email to support@getyourmarriageon.com and I will mail you a gift. Your reviews help others find this podcast, and you help with the very important mission of strengthening marriages everywhere through better intimacy. Now, let's talk about how to strengthen your pelvic floor for better sex and better health. You're about to hear Pauli, the physical therapist, talk about what she does. I'll interject here and there like a narrator to help you follow the conversation.
So, my mission is to provide effective and efficient help and support to help women stop leaking, enjoy pain free intimacy, and return to their pre baby bodies without Kegels. I want to teach you the No Kegels University method, which this is the entire formula, the entire plan of everything you'll need to know. And I'm also going to show you how to solve pain with sex and how to stop leaking and strengthen your pelvic floor. And while we're talking about the pelvic floor, that is going to relate back to having better orgasms.
By the way, Pauli isn't a fan of Kegel exercises. Kegel exercises are where you squeeze your pelvic floor muscles and then release, and you repeat that over and over. You'll hear more about that in a moment. But first, let's understand what a pelvic floor is.
So many people will describe it as a hammock of muscles, that it starts at the front of the pubic bone and then it wraps to the back. I think the pelvic floor is so forgotten in so many fronts, whether that's after we have babies, sometimes it's forgotten as it relates to sex and intimacy and that pelvic floor participating with the orgasm. The pelvic floor is a huge part of the orgasm, which I'll show you here in a moment. I think that it's a lot more complex than what maybe many people realize. And this is where I want to hopefully change your perspective a little bit, but also give you an idea of what's really happening inside.
So, the pelvic floor is far more than just where you put in your tampon or where the baby comes out. It has its own complexity, it's its own set of muscles.
Like I mentioned, there are 3 layers, 12 muscles in total. We all know that. Our pelvic floor should have a normal resting tone or baseline, just like any other muscle group. That muscle should contract, it should return back to that baseline, and it should also lengthen. So, very similar to your bicep, when you do a bicep curl, that muscle shortens or contracts, it returns back to baseline. And then, if I were to extend my arm all the way, that pelvic floor is lengthening. So, very similar to like every other muscle group in our body, the pelvic floor should function similar in that capacity. The orgasm, while there's other pieces that play a role in the orgasm, but the pelvic floor contracting is an orgasm, but it's the strongest pelvic floor contraction that we can have. So, if your muscles are dysfunctional, if they're weak, if you have hip issues, which we'll talk about here in a moment, that very well could be impacting, besides other reasons, how your pelvic floor is showing up for you with an orgasm. And so oftentimes I'll insert this here because I feel like this is a question I get asked a lot. Well, what happens when I'm in the moment with my husband and I'm building and I'm building and I'm building, and then it's like out of nowhere, someone turns off the light or turns off the switch, and I don't feel like an orgasm is even achievable anymore. A lot of that could be the lack of motion or the lack of mobility or the lack of strength, keeping your pelvic floor from tightening or shortening to the extent it needs to help you achieve that orgasm. So I want to add, it's not you, it's just your pelvic floor. It's not yet in a position to help you yet. Yet. The other thing, and this will come up a little bit later, is that our pelvic floor muscles are responsible to respond almost like shock absorption, if you will, to vertical motion. So when we talk about, well, if I jump or laugh or sneeze or cough and I leap, that pelvic floor should, because if you think about if this prior to having kids, that pelvic floor did contract when you coughed, laughed, sneezed, jumped, ran, whatever. But after baby, that pelvic floor may not be strong enough. It might be dysfunctional, and that's why it's not showing up. So it's not necessarily the fact that you had a baby. It's just that your pelvic floor isn't doing its job yet.
This is the part where I asked Pauli to tell us about her method, which she calls the No Kegels University, which she uses to help women repair and strengthen their pelvic floor.
I have studied for a very long time, and that's one of the reasons that I don't really love Kegels, because I don't feel like they do enough. So the No Kegels University method, there are 4 phases. Phase 1 is that your tissues are moving and moving well. Phase 2 is that your pressure system is intact. Phase 3 is that then you can start using strength, using the VAB3 principles to start strengthening those muscles. And then phase 4 is maintenance mode.
So, Polly, this sounds great. Tell us more about phase one, which is all about movement.
So going back to phase one, if you saw me at the gym doing mini squats and you said, "Oh, hey, Polly, good for you for exercising." And I said, "I know, I'm trying to build a booty." And if you know anything about exercise, you would say, "Get your bum to the ground, like full range of motion squats. Why are you doing the mini squats?" You know as well as I do that in order to build a booty or whatever muscle group you're trying to build, you have to use full range of motion. I know we've all seen those funny reels of those people in the gym doing those funny exercises, and you're wondering, where did they watch that? Like, it's not full range of motion. The same principles apply here because I feel like there's this theme. If you look online, do your Kegels, strengthen your pelvic floor, do your Kegels, it'll solve everything. Maybe, but I also think we're forgetting that the muscles can become very short and they can become tight for a couple different reasons. One thing that we know in the 90s, they did this study and they wanted to know, I don't know why they wanted to know this, but they wanted to know what muscles contracted first in response to fearing for your life. And they found that it was the pelvic floor every single time. And the reason that that's important, and again, I've been doing this for a really long time, and I have lots of patients that come in to see me that anytime you're experiencing negative emotion, that if you're anxious, if you're nervous, that your pelvic floor is going to tighten up. So if you had a painful sex moment, your brain, its job is to keep you safe and prove you right. The next time that this happens, whether your husband puts the moves on you or maybe you, your body is saying, "Hey, we got you," and it will tighten up that pelvic floor. And unfortunately, it can become this perpetual cycle that just happens over and over and over. And unfortunately, until we get those muscles moving and moving well, remember phase one, that is where a lot of the change is going to happen with your neuromuscular system, with your brain, how your body is perceiving that. And so, if you are currently struggling with this, please know you are not alone. And it really is pretty easy to, simple to fix, maybe sometimes hard to implement some of the steps, but it really is possible. So, it's not you, it's really your pelvic floor and your brain taking over, trying to take care of you. So, with the phase one, your tissues need to move and move well. That range of motion has to be there before we can get to the strength.
Wow, I can see how important it is to move my body and hips with a full range of motion. I didn't know that my pelvic floor is the first part of my body to tighten under stress. So, what's next?
Phase two is that our pressure system is intact. I won't go too much into depth here, but essentially, the pressure system, it technically starts at our epiglottis in the back of our throat and it goes all the way down to our pelvic floor. And our pelvic floor is part of this pressure system. I'm going to give you the tools you need in order to be able to help that pressure system become intact so it can do its job. So once we have phase one, tissues moving and moving well, phase two, that our pressure system is intact, then we can start with phase three, strengthening. And we're going to be using the VAB3 principles, and I'll go more into depth here. I'm going to give you 5 exercises that you can start doing. If you're listening to this, you can start doing them today. And then we'll talk about phase four, maintenance.
At this point in the workshop, I asked Polly, if you have pain with sex, how do you implement her method to stop or help alleviate that pain? And this is what she said.
So, with that, we're going to use that No Kegels University method as it relates to pain with intimacy right now. In order to get these tissues moving and moving well, we need to know how to do it and we need to know what we're looking for. So, first and foremost, if you have had babies and you have a scar, meaning that if you had an episiotomy or if you tore with childbirth, even if it was a little bit, even if it was a lot, working on that scar mobility is going to be big for you because scar tissue, A, doesn't always stay local, but B, it does what I like to call the Elsa effect. You know, when she like does her, it everything freezes. I've seen it where if the scar tissue is not addressed after having a baby, it will literally, figuratively too, kind of freeze those muscles in time, like the body was trying to heal itself at that time of healing. So a couple months ago, I had this gal, her youngest was 7. I forget how old her oldest was. Her pelvic floor literally felt like an 8-week postpartum pelvic floor. No wonder she was having all the problems because that scar tissue had frozen her in time. So hopefully you can see as I'm going, like, oh, you can see why phase 1 and phase 2 are so important prior to us getting to phase 3.
So, Polly, how did you help her? If you have a scar from childbirth, how did you heal it or have pain free sex afterwards?
Okay, so if you have a scar, I want you to find your scar. Now, I'll also add here that for a lot of women, this is really emotional. It feels very uncomfortable. You may not even feel comfortable with it. Maybe it goes against your morals or what have you. My suggestion to you, you could skip this step if you wanted. Or if you felt more comfortable, you could use a tampon. If you feel like your husband would be a great help in this, then have him help you. And you'll notice here I said pain free. I want you to decide what you're most comfortable with. I don't see many people have a lot of success when skipping this step, but the option is there. It's your body and you get to decide. So, first and foremost, you're going to find that scar. And most of the time, you can see that clock there. 12 o'clock would be to your head, 6 o'clock would be to the bottom. Most women's scars or episiotomies are at the bottom. So, more so if you had an episiotomy, it's probably going to be at that 6 o'clock position. Occasionally, women will tear on the sides, like at 3 and 9, or somewhere in between the 3 and 6 and 9. But it typically, you'll notice it will feel different. It might feel like tissue that's not moving well. Sometimes it will feel like there's a string that's been slid underneath your muscle and it protrudes a little bit. That is what your scar feels like. So you're going to work on going right to left, left to right, up and down, and doing circles. And this is pain free. So use whatever pressure creates pain free. If an area doesn't tolerate that very well, then go somewhere else. Or sometimes you might even need to get off that scar and do the area surrounding that scar first before you get to being on the scar directly. And that's only 1 to 2 times a week. Please do not discount how simple this is to do. This is a piece that I will say when women come back to me and they're like, oh, I'm not making any progress. This is the piece that they miss sometimes. So please don't forget it.
Can you explain how exactly to stretch around the scar?
So you're going to insert your thumb, much like I mentioned above. It's easier to do with our thumb than it is to do with our pointer finger. And you're just going to gently work stretching around that clock. You use whatever pressure you want, work on the certain depths. You'll know where the areas are going to be that are going to be the most painful, but pain free. Because if you remember that cycle I talked about before, we don't want to perpetuate this cycle of pain with touch and then pain and touch and then pain, because then the next time your body's like, hey, I got you. And we're going to tighten up. We want to interrupt that cycle. And that's why this pain free pressure and stretching is actually going to give you a lot more bang for your buck and your time than what you would imagine. And I hope that this feels doable. I've had one couple, the husband would actually help with the stretching, and they both would watch The Office and laugh. So it totally removed them from this intimate, like I'm wearing lingerie and my husband's helping me stretch, like just to really kind of separate and put, okay, this is therapy time in a box and then sexy time can be later. I had one gal, she's like, okay, husband, you cannot come in. I need to do my therapy. She personally didn't want her husband involved in the therapy. She just I'm using therapy loosely. I'm not providing you therapy. I'm just giving you suggestions. But she would say, okay, I want to do it on my own. And then when I'm with my husband, I just want that to be our time, not necessarily him having to help me with the therapy or the homework. So you know your relationship best. So use what's going to help you. Hopefully some of those give you some ideas on how to proceed.
If you want to watch the full replay of this on our website, Pauli answers questions about if this applies to women if they haven't had a baby yet, if the stretching is done inside or outside of the vagina, and what to do if you can still feel your stitches, and her opinion of the use of dilators, and much, much more. Pauli then explains that in addition to stretching the vagina manually, there are other things you can do to get your pelvic floor muscles stretched in the right way and moving in the right way.
Okay, so still part of that phase 1, getting your tissues moving and moving well, I want you to work on your hip mobility. So you'll see in this first picture, she's doing a hula hoop. That hula hooping motion is really helpful. If you're doing the hula hoop, you're creating all of this motion inside the joint. that is going to coax those hip muscles to have a lot more range of motion, to have more blood flow, which in turn is going to help those tissues, that pelvic floor, start moving and moving well. You can see here this gal, she has her foot on the stump. She's doing like a hip flexor stretch. So that would be really great. I wouldn't have you hold it statically. I would kind of have you rock back and forth in and out of that stretch gently. Again, because we want to create a lot of motion to help those tissues move and to move well. You can see this gal here, she's doing a piriformis stretch, really just trying to create as much hip mobility as possible to allow that pelvic floor to come along. And then that is going to help us finish up with phase one, getting our tissues moving and moving well.
Pauli then explains phase 2, which is our pressure system and a specific way to help your pelvic floor.
And I know we all have at least heard about diaphragmatic breathing. So balloon breathing is diaphragmatic breathing, except it's calling into play all the other pieces of our pressure system. So when we diaphragmatic breathe, technically what's happening is the lower lobes of our lungs fill with air. The diaphragm that sits underneath it drops. That is going to create a pressure or a volume change. And then all of our guts that sit underneath of it, they're going to move downward, which they're supposed to do, by the way. And then that volume or pressure change is now going to press against those pelvic floor muscles, which, if you remember, those muscles should move out of the way, assuming they're happy and healthy, when there's pressure, when there's that volume change. If you imagine that you have a balloon inside of your belly, it's hooked to a helium tank. As soon as you start to inhale, that belly is going to blow up, because if you're imagining that balloon hooked on that helium tank, that balloon's going to get bigger and bigger and expand. So the front of our belly is going to blow up. The sides of our trunk or our abdomen is going to blow up, meaning our rib cage is going to come along with that. The back of our rib cage is also going to expand as well. And then we have a bottom to that balloon. So as that balloon, hopefully you're imagining your last trip to the dollar store to get your balloons filled with helium. That's the last time I was there. And I remember that bottom moving downward. That's what your pelvic floor should be following. And then when we exhale, then think about, okay, well, the air's leaving, right? So the lungs are going to deflate, diaphragm's going to return, the guts are going to move upward, and then that pelvic floor is also going to rise as well. And the other thing I'll add here is a lot of my patients that come to me with pain with sex, because there's so much anxiety and they're just so panicked about various different things. Maybe they've had trauma, maybe there could be so many things. When we balloon breathe or take a deep breath or diaphragmatically breathe, like people say, like, just take a deep breath, calm down. When we're doing this balloon breathing, it actually helps turn on our rest and digest system. So I'm going to tell you to do this as an exercise. You can also use it as a technique with pain with sex, because it's going to help that pelvic floor start to relax. And really, this probably packs a bigger punch than coming to see me in person sometimes. I'm super honest about that, because if you can go home and solve this and improve this part of your marriage, done. Go do it, run with it. I love sharing this piece. The other part I'll say for any pregnant mamas out there is balloon breathing is a really good tool when you're having your baby, because that baby, you can use balloon breathing for this too. This pelvic floor, it needs to lengthen, right? And get bigger for baby to pass through. So if you're sitting there and you're clenching, like trying to push down, well, that pelvic floor is probably tightening up and then baby's just bumping up against it. If you can balloon breathe, so as you inhale, that pelvic floor drops, pause, and then you can add a little, and then that the baby's going to have an easier time. Your risk of tearing is going to be less. Your risk of having an episiotomy is less. Okay, I could go on about this pregnancy. So hopefully that kind of helps with that part a little bit.
At this point in the workshop, Pauli shared a video of a woman laying on her back demonstrating balloon breathing, and I was impressed.
So that is balloon breathing. And my suggestion to you is to do this 60 to 80 times a day. When you get really good at this, then you can bump it down to 30 to 40. But in the beginning, you only get to count your reps if that pelvic floor drops. If you're having a hard time, it's going to feel counterintuitive. Flip over onto your belly. That pressure on your belly It'll help emphasize that rib cage expanding and you'll get really good there. So if you're standing listening to this and you're trying to do it, I'm quite certain you're going to have a hard time just because of gravity if it's the first time you've ever done it. So I would try it on your back or laying on your belly the first little bit until you really get it and then move on to other positions.
Polly explains how this helps not only with pain during intimacy, but addressing leaking, especially after having children.
And then if you're having leaking, we need that pressure system to be intact. So, like I said before, when you laugh, run, cough, sneeze, you leaked. It's because your pelvic floor isn't responding to that vertical pressure. It's not strong enough to do that yet. So, if you think back to before you had kids and you ran, laughed, coughed, run, jumped, that pelvic floor at that point was strong enough to do its job so you weren't leaking. That's part of that pressure system being there. And so if the pressure system is doing its job, but the pelvic floor is just weak, well, that will come with phase three. But I think it's important to remember that this balloon breathing is going to pack a much bigger punch. I can't tell you the amount of women that will come back after their first visit and we work on phase one and phase two, and they'll say, oh, yeah, I'm totally stronger. And they'll say, well, yeah, I'm leaking 50% less because I've been working on phase one and phase two. And so hopefully that gives you some hope that just even and every body is different, but working on phase one and phase two will pack a much bigger punch than what you realize.
That takes care of phase one, which is about mobility and stretching in your pelvic floor, and phase two, which is all about breathing deep into your pelvic floor, a simple yet often overlooked phase. Polly then goes on to explain her next phase.
So that takes care of phase one and phase two as it relates to pain with intimacy. So, are you ready to get into phase three? This is my favorite part, using the strength through the VAB3 principles. I know a lot of people ask, well, why don't you like Kegels? Well, when I was first out of school and treating the pelvic floor, I felt like, man, it is taking me like 16 to 18 visits to get these women better. But these women are mothers and they don't have time for this. Like, we need to hurry this up. And everyone kept telling me, all my mentors, they're like, well, that's how the body is. We have to do Kegels. And I thought, just squeezing and relaxing but you guys keep telling me the pelvic floor does a whole lot more. We don't strengthen any other muscle group by just squeezing and relaxing and squeezing and relaxing. So if the pelvic floor is so important, why are we just squeezing and relaxing? It needs more. So I dug in to figure out what really does the pelvic floor do? And if that's what it's doing naturally and physiologically, well, why do we have to reinvent the book here or reinvent the wheel? And so that's where I came up with these ZAP3 principles. This is how the pelvic floor works. Vertical. So I've mentioned this already. So the pelvic floor responds to downward pressure. So if I were to jump, this is my pelvic floor. If I were to jump and when I land, my pelvic floor actually should, assuming it's strong enough, which it is, it'll tighten so I'm not experiencing pressure on my bladder and then I'm peeing my pants when I jump. Same thing with laughing or what have you. So we're going to use this vertical component.
Okay, so that was the V in VAB3 or VAB3. So what does the A, B, and 3 stand for?
Above the pelvis or arm overhead. If we use this principle, it is going to help load or make our pelvic floor work. And so anything that's happening above the pelvis, if my arm's overhead, that is going to allow that pelvic floor to show up. B is for below the pelvis. And this is essentially when we talked about whatever the hip does or doesn't do, it decides what the pelvic floor does or doesn't do. And so this has to be done in weight bearing. So if you're just laying on the ground and doing like a leg lift, that won't count. It has to be in weight bearing. And then 3 for all 3 planes. So one of the interesting things about the pelvic floor is that it's the only group of muscles in the body that has fibers that run in all 3 planes, which is front to back, side to side, and then diagonal or rotational. So if we're 3D people living in a 3D world, hopefully you can see how this is so important in what we're doing and in utilizing that pelvic floor.
So, how do people implement this in normal life? It's pretty hard to add new things to our busy schedules as it is.
So you can consider any exercise a pelvic floor exercise if it has at least 2 of these 4 principles. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So you can take some of the suggestions I give you. You can take what you're already doing and hold the VAB3 principles up against it and you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. Maybe you just need to throw in or change your exercise program just a little bit. And I'll say here, this is 10 minutes, 4 to 6 days a week. This is the absolute minimum. So it really isn't that much. And you'll notice if you're working on your scar, I said 30 to 60 seconds, 1 to 2 days a week, and the hip mobility as well. And then phase 2 was the balloon breathing 60 to 80 times. Once you get really good at that, that's probably under 3 minutes. And then you move on to, you'll kind of cycle through. We'll talk about this in phase 4, but then now you just have 10 minutes. This is totally easy. And I'll be honest, most of my pelvic floor work I do is while I'm brushing my teeth, while I'm cooking, while I'm waiting for my child to like tell me what she's trying to tell me. And it's taking her 5 minutes. I do a lot of my work doing other things that I'm doing. I don't necessarily carve out specific time for that. Maybe I shouldn't admit that, but it's possible. It's totally possible.
At this point in the workshop, Pauli walked us through 5 exercises involving squats and lunges with various foot and arm positions to utilize the vertical component, above the pelvis, below the pelvis, and movement in all 3 planes. You can watch these videos in the full workshop, and it's around the 45-minute mark.
You'll notice that if you hold up this VAB3 method against what you're doing, you'll find that you're probably working that pelvic floor a lot more frequently than what you thought. And really going back to the beginning and saying, okay, where am I at with phase 1? Where am I at with phase 2? A lot of times for a lot of women, that's where that missing piece is.
Before we wrap up, let's get a brief overview of stage 4, which is the maintenance stage.
So for maintenance, so once you've kind of worked your way through, and maintenance starts when you feel like you have reached your goals. You're not having pain with intimacy. You are not leaking like you used to. And then you can drop it down. So now you're doing 8 to 10 minutes rather than that 10 to 15 minutes. And you're now doing it 3 to 5 days a week rather than the 4 to 6 days a week. And maintenance is so easy. And this is where I see a lot of people fall off sometimes after they've worked so hard to get their goal. They have to be able to maintain that. But hopefully you can see that there doesn't really have to be a lot of effort in this. It really is quite simple to do at home and in between what you have happening.
I then asked our live audience for questions for Pauli to address. There were about 10 questions answered, and here are 2 that I wanted to share with you on the podcast. How long till I see results? How long should I be doing these exercises before I see results?
Good question. So on average, phase 1 and phase 2 is about a month or 2. If you're pretty far out and your scarring is pretty tough, that could be longer. Assuming that you have done a really good job with phase 1 and phase 2, and you are consistent with phase 3, it's about 2 to 3 months. Because we also have to allow time for those muscles to grow. And then phase 4 is maintenance. So you're just living there for the rest of your life. Make it exciting.
All right. My leaking is sneezing. Mine are violent. So I think she has very violent sneezes and
Okay.
coughing.
Okay.
Is there a difference if it's not also with jumping and movement?
Oh, good question. No, because it's still that pressure, right? So when you sneeze, achoo, think about how, especially if you're doing it violently, that's a lot of pressure that your pelvic floor should be responding to as you're sneezing. And so whether that's jumping and landing, like if you jumped off a plyo box or something and you leaked then, it's still a pelvic floor issue. My thought is that the type of exercise to get that pelvic floor stronger needs to have a lot more oomph behind it, because if it is that violent, that is a lot of pressure, and potentially it's one sneeze after another. So it could be like a lack of endurance thing too.
Gotcha. Tell everyone about your No Kegels University, how they can reach out to you, more of your program, because I'm sure there's a lot more questions people are going to have beyond the 5 minutes we have left.
Sure. You are welcome to DM me on Instagram. It's at Beyond the V by Pauli. My website is Beyond the V by Pauli. It's one word. No Kegels University is on there with all of my programs. I just set this up. It's a form. It's called Your Pelvic Floor's Next Step. It's just a form you can fill out. If you are like, no, I just want to ask a question, you can just fill out the form, and then I'm happy to converse back and forth with you that way. That email is protected in that it's technically HIPAA protected. So if you're like, well, I don't want to do it on Instagram because I don't want anyone to find out, then you can do it via email. on there. And I'm happy to chat with whoever if you want a program or know what's a good fit. But really I have given you the roadmap, the entire method. This is all most of my secrets. So hopefully that gives you a good head start. And if you want to chat later or what have you, I don't want you to feel like I'm selling to you. I really do want to provide effective and efficient information for you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.